All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining the Communicating Boundaries About Your Time and Work with Your Colleagues and Supervisors workshop. This is part of the GRWB Writing Bootcamp. Joining us today are three panelists, the first of which is Tashelle Lawson, President of FIG Strategy and Consulting. We're also joined by Dr. Richard Gardner, Associate Professor from the Department of Management, Entrepreneurship, and Technology here at UNLV, and then Dr. John Hirano, Goals Coach at US Bank. They'll be answering your questions about those boundaries that we set with our colleagues and supervisors. And I'm going to hand it off to them for any other information they'd like to share before we ask our first question. So John, do you mind taking it away for us?
Oh, not at all. Excuse me. A little bit about myself and some of my background. I am currently part of the US Bank team of Goals Coaches here in Las Vegas. We have a great partnership with the Graduate College, which allows us to do coaching for free for all of the graduate students, as well as any member of the UNLV family. A little bit about myself. Prior to finding myself in Goals Coaching and with US Bank, I spent my time, my career in various areas of education, from high schools through colleges prior as a professor. My particular background and interests are in engineering, but I find myself now doing coaching really because I enjoy helping people kind of find that moment and that it moment to kind of figure out what they really want to do with their lives and what are those things that are really important to them. It's a little bit about myself. Richard?
Yeah, so I'm Richard Gardner. I'm an associate professor in the management area at UNLV. So some of the things that I teach and research involve organizational behavior, HR related topics. And one of the things we teach about is, setting expectations and communication as well, which I think is pertinent to what we're talking about today. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tashelle Lawson. I am the president of FIG Strategy and Consulting, based here in Las Vegas. I'm also a Las Vegas native, very proud advocate for small businesses, women in leadership, and I am honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for those introductions. And Tashelle, I'd like to direct the first question to you, if that's okay. It's kind of the big question for the workshop, which is going to be answered based on everyone's personal experience. But why do you think that setting boundaries about time and work is even an important endeavor to begin with?
Well, let's start with burnout. Without setting boundaries, you're at a much higher risk of burnout. Um, and I'm of the school that a heartfelt no is far more impactful than a half-hearted yes. So just understanding that we all have capacities, right? And we control when we are going to expire or when we're not, right? And so setting boundaries is the responsibility of the individual, not anyone else, right? So Tashelle is the only one that can say when Tashelle is going to hit a limit. So I have an obligation to both myself and to John, for example, to be honest about what I can and can't do instead of expecting John to assume or know what those limits are. I think that in the business world, especially now that everything is so digital, there's this expectation that we should just have this endless abundance of availability. And again, setting a boundary is the responsibility of the individual. So it's good for mental health. There's also a responsibility to the people outside of your job, which you tend to spend the most time with, right? Like your family, who I'm of the belief deserve the most from you, right? Like they deserve your absolute best. And so the responsibility is on you. So that's my approach to boundaries.
I appreciate that insight. Dr. Gardner, Dr. Hirano, did you want to add anything about that question and why you think that boundaries are important?
I would just say one thing that I think is important about it is, I kind of mentioned this, but it's about managing expectations. And not only what is it that people can expect out of you, but also what you expect out of other people as well. When it comes to availability, when it comes to communication, I actually have kind of seen this with my wife and her work, as Tichelle kind of alluded to, is she's been doing a lot of remote work, and so there's kind of this expectation that they're working at 7 p.m. At night, doing their Slack and all of this stuff, and it's a little bit different. And so I think you have to be okay with setting expectations and managing those expectations. That's all I would add to it.
Yeah, and I think for myself, I think I just want to echo the whole idea about burnout and knowing what your tank looks like. I'll speak from experience that I've probably been on the end of just like burning that candle at both ends nonstop, especially during grad school. I think it's even a lot easier sometimes when you're like, oh, this paper is due, this thing is due, and you're there and working terrible hours. But understanding that, like, at the end of the day, your life is more than just school. It's important. I'm not saying it's not. Grad school is important. That's why you're here. But there is a life that goes beyond that, and you are a person that is a whole person. And so kind of keeping that in mind throughout the whole process.
Thank you so much for that. You know, Dr. Gardner, you mentioned specifically that your wife is involved on Slack and working at 7 p.m. And I'm not sure if this question directly applies to it, but I wanted to ask you, Dr. Gardner, and all of you. A question came in the chat. If you have any advice about setting boundaries when navigating different time zones. For example, I'm here in the Pacific time zone, but I do a large amount of work with the East Coast, 3 hours ahead. I end up having to be up very early in order to work with people out east, but people I work with locally don't necessarily understand I've been working since 5 a.m. If I need to slow down my day in the early afternoon. So any advice on that? I'm not sure if that applies to your wife, Dr. Gardner, but any of you, what do you do when you're working with people in different time zones?
So in my wife's situation, it's kind of strange. They're all in the same time zone, but they're still, doing this thing. But from an academic standpoint, I know that I have co-authors that are on the East Coast, or actually a good friend of mine and co-author, he just moved to France, and we discussed about where he's 9 hours away. And I think that from that instance, it's trying to understand when the availability needs to occur. So you might have these hours that you need to collaborate on something in terms of a live conversation, and you can find out what those windows of hours may be, and then figure out what's the autonomous work. And in some ways, with my friend in France, it's great. Like, he can work on something, go to bed, finish his day, pass it on to me. So actually the project kind of is working all at the same time. And if we need to collaborate, we actually even figure that out. Like, early morning for me, when he's kind of ending his day there, is a good time for us to connect if we're needing to collaborate. So I think trying to find those windows, but that's a real deal as we've kind of expanded our work teams across the country and globally.
Yeah, I'll add to that if I can. So I'm approaching it from a small business owner's perspective. If I have a client in New York or a client in London, I'm working whatever hours I need to based on my client. However, there's an adjustment that I'll make to my work schedule to accommodate. So if I need to be up for a 6 a.m. call, I'm probably not going to work until 6 o'clock that evening. And so getting comfortable with setting boundaries and also speaking up and advocating for yourself is something that the sooner you can learn and develop that habit, the better. I know in a lot of situations that tends to happen with time. You just get more comfortable speaking up and saying, hey, X, Y, or Z. But the reality is, like, the more remote, the more available we become, the more expanded our expectations are going to be as well, right? So the expectation of you being able to be in Las Vegas, but also service a client out of the country is going to be the norm. If you want to work from home without having to actually move to France, then you're going to have to adjust your schedule. So speaking up for yourself and setting those boundaries are going to be important. And that's okay, right? So your work schedule may start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon where everyone else's starts at 6, or it may end at a specific time. but making sure that you're taking as much ownership as you possibly can. Because again, small business owner, if I have an employee that is not speaking up, I'm assuming that their capacity is fine, right? And they're okay getting up and taking a 6 a.m. call and then working until 4 or 5 o'clock. So making sure that you're speaking up for yourself.
And then one thing I want to add is I think, so part of my responsibility is working with a team from here through the East Coast for a large organization. And so we had a working agreement. So as a team, everyone sat down and said, hey, I'm available for meetings from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific time. And so no matter where they were, everyone knew like only scheduling things during this block. And then everyone were adults. So, and hopefully your team is full of mature adults that everyone can kind of manage their time and their energy and their input. But that kind of helped to know that like, hey, having these bigger, I think we're talking about communication and setting boundaries that, hey, as a team, we agree that this is going to be the best time for everybody. This is kind of that working agreement. So I will always be available for you, obviously, other than personal matters or other things that come up. But in general, these will be the time slots that I'm going to be available on our working days. It was also very helpful.
I like what I'm hearing from the three of you, because I see this through line of this common theme, which is that it ultimately lands on the person to communicate with somebody else or to say explicitly, hey, these are the things I'm doing and this is why. Maybe I'm not going to work past 4, I was up at 6, or this is what's important to me to maintain my own well-being in the context of these working obligations. So I think that's really good for our audience to hear. And I wanted to ask so some of the things you've already brought up are saying, hey, I'm going to tell my colleagues or supervisor, I'm not going to work at this time because I was up at this time. But what are some other things that you do in your professional lives? What are some other boundaries you've chosen to set that haven't yet been mentioned that you think might be useful for the audience?
Turn your phone off, right? Make yourself unavailable. One of the things that I am great at is timers. So my phone goes off whether you want it to or not. I am unavailable from this time to this time. So if I choose to check in, then I'm choosing to check in. But again, I can't stress the ownership part of this enough, right? So taking more control. I know that I started to get cranky, right? So it's probably not the time for me to be responding to someone who's asking me a question that I know could have waited until tomorrow at 9. I don't want to get that message at 9 o'clock at night because I'm going to be irritated in my response. So I eliminate that potential, right? By setting that boundary and turning the phone off. Making sure that it's, again, very clear when you are available. I'm the person that will just keep repeating the tried and true method, and that is speak up for yourself, set those boundaries, and when all else fails, turn off your phone. Turn off your phone, turn off your phone.
Oh, I can add to that a little bit because I find myself that I go through. Whoops. Oh, sorry. I find that I go through phases in terms of what my demands at home may be and what my demands in life may be, and also what my demands at work may be. And I think that some of that can be, you can think a little bit forward about what might be coming up and manage expectations that way. So here's a very timely anecdote is I'm actually on my sabbatical. Like I just started my sabbatical and I've kind of said, hey, I'm not going to be doing administrative meetings and stuff. And then I get this email inviting me to a panel about talking about boundaries. And I'm like, okay, well, they don't know that I'm really on sabbatical and I'm on the advisory board for Grad Academy here. And so, and this is not like a big, time thing for me. So I was like, okay, I'll do this. But in my response, knowing what the fall looks like, I also said, hey, just so you know, in the fall, when you guys have meetings, I may have limited participation because I'm on sabbatical. So I think some of those things in terms of trying to plan ahead of when you may be out of town, when you might have some obligations, I think that is important to also manage those expectations of thinking a bit forward. of when things might be a little bit more busy or when you might be also a little bit more available. Yeah, that's what I would add, I think, to that question.
Can I add a quick comment? Really, John, I know you want to speak, but I would also say to that, because you are on sabbatical, you could have also just said no, right? So there's not, and I'm not throwing any shade. I'm saying like for our audience, right, for the attendees, right? When you've already set a goal for yourself and you're taking time off, you can also just commit to that. I'm not available. Full stop.
And one before John mentions this, I had read a book recently, and this is another professor somewhere else, and she actually does an assignment with her students that she tells them their assignment is to go through a whole day to say no to every request that they get. And that is the assignment. And of course, the person says, like, if it's some life altering, like if you're getting proposed to or something that day, like, don't just say no, like, but be a little judicious that way. But the concept is, one, it's empowering to be able to say no to requests, and two, it helps these students. They learn that people they they won't think bad of you if you say no. Sometimes we want to be a people pleaser, and we want to make sure, especially when you're like a grad student, it's your advisor, it's, there's some power dynamics that way, but just know that you're not necessarily losing face, you're not losing value or perception from the other person just by saying no to a request. Yeah. So yeah, for sure, be comfortable saying no.
Yeah. My first thought was, what if I say no to that assignment? Just straight up, like, no, fine, I'm just not doing this assignment, but I'm going to say yes to everything. No. I think I can easily get stuck in kind of that same place for myself to kind of just be like, yeah, I can do it. And I think we often overestimate our own bandwidth. That's something to remember. I think we all think we can get, especially on the short term, like, hey, what can you get done this week or today? I think we all think we can do more than we can. And I think remembering that is hard sometimes. Because you're like, oh yeah, I can do one more email. Oh, I can send out one more thing. I can generate one last thing. And again, with power dynamics and whose those requests are coming from, there is a hierarchy, I think, in our lives. And sometimes we have to remember it's like us, family, and then work stuff. And that includes a professor. Sorry, all professors. But that's the truth, right? It's having to know where that is and what's important to you. But I think that the short note of that is, one, remember that I think we overestimate what we can do. And then for me, the thing that I rely on is my calendar. My calendar. If it's in my calendar, I do it. If my calendar is blocked, it means it's blocked. Sometimes that gets a little more sticky with life and work and how it intertwines. But generally, when it comes to that stuff, it's like, hey, my calendar is there. You see what I have available and what I don't have available. So I live pretty religiously through my calendar.
I love that you mentioned the hierarchy, John, because I've been thinking about this as I listen to you, and and this is the throw shade. I want to play the devil's advocate because it relates to another question about how your boundaries have changed over time. But someone might say, well, you're an associate professor, Dr. Gardner, or Dr. Hirano, you're a working professional, or Tashelle, you are a president of a small business. So, what is it like for somebody who maybe is at the lower end of the hierarchy, or is a graduate student who is reporting to somebody that's far higher up in the status? Like, how do you communicate those, and have your boundaries changed as you've worked your way through different levels of that hierarchy?
Yeah, so being fully transparent, my boundaries when I was first entering the workforce were pretty non-existent, right? Because I didn't understand my own capacity. I didn't understand my own boundaries, or how to set them. What I understood was I was ambitious and I wanted to absorb every nugget of information available. So if the director was in at 8:30, I was in at 7:15. If the director was leaving at 6 o'clock, I was leaving at 6:45. So the demand was different because my goals were different, right? When I was first starting. So let's also not forget the more obvious thing is what exactly is it that you're trying to accomplish? I'm trying to get an RFP out. I could be tired as heck, but boundaries don't exist because I'm thinking about what I stand to gain by actually closing this contract? So understanding that boundaries will change, they will shift, they will move based on what's going on in your life at that time. I will give this example. This was maybe 10 or 12 years ago in my career. I was working as a what was I doing? I was a event director, and my boss called me on a Saturday afternoon and told me that I had 1 hour to get to property for a meeting. And I said, I'm not coming. I was at I was in the office all week and you mentioned nothing about a meeting and I have plans. And so, sorry. I was a director, right? So it's a little bit different. I was very comfortable saying I'm not coming in because here's why. And I gave my reasons, and that was that. So two things happened in that situation. One, I established that we need to have very clear communications when to show Lawson is concerned. If you want me to show up to a meeting on Saturday afternoon, we are going to call me more than an hour in advance, or I'm not showing up, right? Two, that I was very comfortable saying no. And that for me was very important, that I was comfortable saying no. That's not what's going to happen. I realize that that's probably not where a lot of people sit, but your time is the only thing that you yourself will never, ever, ever get back. I don't care who you are, you don't get it back. So it is on you to own and to manage that. And understand that at certain points in your career, you're going to give more of it away because you're trying to get something in return, right? Like there's something else at stake here. Again, earlier in my career, I was very, very free giving with the time. Now I'm incredibly selective.
I agree with that 100%. And I think for those that are kind of in that, grad school phase, and I'm talking to those that are probably in that full time, right? So maybe you have a GA, maybe you are an RA for professor. I remember when that season of my life, I think I was like that, right? You just kind of give, and that line between this is my working hours and this is my personal research hours, pretty much disappears, right? I promised Nevada that I wouldn't share this, but I'm going to share it anyways. I was terrible, but I also knew I had the time to give, and I knew what worked for me, right? So I would personally love working late at night, and the lab was quiet. No one was around to bother me because labs can get noisy for those that are in that space. And so I would work from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. That, not all the time, but when papers were due, dissertations were due, or deadlines were coming up, that was my space because I knew it was quiet, it was away from everybody. But the rest of my life could work around that, right? I knew I had rest that could come the next day. I knew I could come in late the next afternoon, but those things were communicated with my professor. And with that, just making sure that you do. Sometimes you have to give more, but I also didn't have a family. I didn't have a wife. Those other secondary things were just my immediate family, was just me. Single guy, just doing research. I had all the time in the world for it. Now you ask me, nope, 5 o'clock, I'm done. I have a wife, I have a kid at home. And so those things come up, you move on in your life, and it changes. It does over time. It changes. But I think, like you were saying earlier, when you have the time to give, when you're younger, earlier in your career, you're going to give it because that's what you have the most value of at that time. But I think as you move on in your career, what becomes more valuable is that experience that you carry with you, what you've moved on, the knowledge. And so how much each hour of your day is worth more, so you can keep more of it. The way I kind of see it a little bit.
Yeah, these are really interesting points, and it's one that it's pretty salient to me. So I got married just over a year ago, and people have asked me like, how's that like, and what have been some of the adjustments? And I always say I've had to learn how to work again, because, in the academic world, and I'm sure this is very similar to what a lot of the students in their kind of grad school world is it's kind of like, it's not an 8 to 5 job. It's kind of this amorphous, when are you working? It works best for you. And for me, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay working a Saturday afternoon or something, or working in the evening in those days. But now when it's like, well, I need to be available, or we have plans. So it's had me to kind of learn how to work again in a different situation, and actually to piggyback off of also what Tichelle had said of making yourself unavailable. Sometimes I'll actually even just go to the library and work in the afternoon. This is kind of the equivalent of turning off your phone, because I know I will not take phone calls. I will not take meetings. If my phone rings while I'm in the library, like it's too much of a hassle for me to go out of the library and take a phone call. So I'm just like, yeah, I'm not gonna do this. Um, the other thing I would say about this too is there's two things. One is we talk about these expectations with employers, but I think whatever your life situation is, you can have that same conversation with perhaps your family as well. So I just went to a conference and my wife, didn't go to the conference with me, and we before we even left, we discussed like, okay, what are the expectations in terms of checking in and just seeing how things are going and all of that. And I think that that's also a discussion to be able to have, if your with your family members, if that's kind of your situation you're in. Um, and then the second thing I was going to say is, as we talk about the times that we want to block out away from work, I think we also have to make sure that the times that we've blocked in for work, that we are present in those situations. If all the boss is here and it's like, nope, I can't do that. Nope, I can't do that. And yes, we do need to say no, but at the times when it's there, like, hey, yeah, I'm here and we're working, you have to make that an efficient, good use of time there. I think that gives you the capital to say, yeah, I'm not going to do this later. So keep that in mind as well.
Spot on, Dr. Gardner. Yeah. You can't go around saying no if you haven't if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. It's a very important point to add.
I love that you brought that up, Dr. Gardner, because it kind of flips the workshop on its head because we're talking about blocking around work, right? But it's just as important as you brought up that idea of doing good work when you are working, right? And so, I mean, that makes me think of the concept of deep work. There's a book about it by the same name. And so, this is kind of a question that just kind of naturally came up for me, but while you're talking about this, do you feel like the way in which, and this is the three of you, the way in which you approach setting boundaries with your family as you're trying to work or your friends, different or same process by which you would set those boundaries with your colleagues, your supervisors?
Who's gonna go first?
Oh, that's a tough one, and that's one maybe I'm still kind of learning. I think I'm learning to prioritize family over work in that sense. Like that discussion is very different because work is a bit transactional in many ways, where a family relationship is less so. Um, and so, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a tricky balance in the sense of like for example, my wife and I we had like a medical appointment earlier today, but I had already had some research things scheduled for that day, and but this other thing couldn't be rescheduled, and I needed to be there with my wife, and so I just was like, well, I'll reschedule this work meeting, to see if I can do that, and lo and behold, it got rescheduled, and we're gonna talk a different time. It's not an urgent thing, and where this other thing was a little bit more urgent, but uh, yeah, I think that I don't know. I think that's going to be different for everybody, probably.
Yeah, my families they're the biggest time thieves. So I have to be very careful. Because again, small business owners, I think it's a little bit different when you have a set schedule, right? When I was going to a building as an employee, my mom was so much more respectful of my time. Now that I'm a business owner, she feels that I'm just, I don't know, sitting in an office playing around on the computer. So she just feels it's okay to call her. So we've had to have very, very direct conversations about from this time to this time, unless there is an emergency, there's no time. Don't call and text me. And that's a conversation that needed to take place now that didn't need to take place when I was employed by someone else. So I think that again, depending on where you are, like I don't have children, And so my sister, who is a mommy, is always assuming that I'm available to do all of these things with her and my niece when she wants to do them. And I am available. I'm just not interested, right? And I want to stay home and I want to have a glass of wine or whatever the case may be. So being able to communicate your boundaries, whether you're communicating with friends and family to protect your mental health, or you're protecting your time at work, both are important, and will have different levels of importance depending on where you are and what your priorities are.
I completely agree with all of that. And I think family often is the most challenge, is probably more difficult than a boss, right? Because in some ways, I think we're saying it being transactional. They're paying for your time, so they feel like they own some of it. But you can also be like, you only have my 40 hours, and that's all you're getting. Some weeks is more, some weeks is less, yes. But generally, you can kind of come across that way. When it comes to family, it's a little bit more challenging. My worst piece is my 1-year-old daughter. So working remote was more challenging on that end because she knew where my office door was, and she didn't care. She didn't care that she was yelling and screaming. But I think sometimes it is creating physical boundaries. I think sometimes with that, right? It's putting yourself at the library, it's getting yourself out of the house if you are working remote, finding a coffee shop or wherever you can physically work and still do your job, and having sometimes those physical boundaries. But it's a tougher conversation with family more often than not because I think their expectations of us are different, and as much as, and I think our care is different, right? The amount that we're invested in those relationships is sometimes different. I think as a small business owner, it's different because that's your baby, I can assume. But when you're working for someone else or a bigger corporation, that conversation at home is often more difficult, at least through my experience.
One little story with this is a friend of mine who does research on kind of role transitions throughout the day, going from home to work. And he described how when he worked at home and he had little kids, and he had to do something, a little bit of a symbolic thing. And so he would actually, he had a little office to work in at home, and he would actually get kind of dressed up like he's going to work, and he'd tell his kids, Dad's going to work today, and go into the other office. And so they knew that he had kind of made this actual transition from home into work. His outfit was different, and Dad's working in there or whatever. And so you can get a little bit creative if you have to try to signal things to people that may not quite understand what you're trying to accomplish there. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that insight about, speaking to our families and setting those boundaries with them. I mean, equally as important in maintaining that focus and that concentration, being able to do work well, but also keep a healthy family life. I just wanted to turn it back a little bit to specifically what it's like being a graduate student. So just because our audience is largely graduate students, Dr. Rano, you mentioned that when you were in grad school, you went at it because you knew you had that time. You were young, you were single at the time, you were just kind of dedicating a lot of time. But I didn't hear too much yet about your experience specifically, Dr. Gardner. So to either of you, like, what do you do when you're trying to set these boundaries, specifically with your advisor on your dissertation or your thesis? And what do you do if your advisor is just not having it, or maybe not on the same page as you when it comes to setting these boundaries about time and work?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as John had talked about that, like the ebb and flow of having time and not having time. This is a tricky one because there is a bit of a power dynamic, with an advisor and a grad student. I think that in many ways, and every discipline is going to be a little bit different. I didn't work in a lab. I didn't, I have a brother actually that does microbiology, and they have lab expectations for their students, and it can be incredibly time consuming over holidays, all of these things that, they need their experiments to be done. Part of this, I think, is, at least from my perspective, so much of it is generally outcome based, in the sense of, at least in my field, we have deadlines for certain things. I don't care if you spend 40 hours on it or 8 hours, and I don't care if it's in the middle of the night or, in terms of, there's so much flexibility of when to do the work. We just know that it needs to get done at a certain time. And especially, John kind of mentioned this, especially in academics, everything's very slow. It's always going to be probably twice as long as what you think it'll take. And so try to prevent yourself from overpromising, perhaps. I mean, we want to be ambitious. We want to do these things. We want to say these, say we're going to be on top of it. But I remember that early in my career when I was this assistant professor and I was getting tasked with some committee work, and they said, oh, well, when could you do this thing? And it was not a very difficult thing, but I just knew that I had other priorities. And I said, oh, give me about a week to do that. And one of the other, more senior professors like, a week? Like this should take you like an hour to do or something. And it's not about the time to do it. It's, I've got other priorities, to be doing. And so I think from that perspective, try to have that conversation with your advisor about what is the work that needs to be prioritized to help establish those deadlines and when they should appropriately be made.
I think to add to that just a little bit, choosing your professor is, I think as you try to figure out what you want to do, it's important, right? And I'm going to say that cautiously because sometimes you don't have a choice. Because sometimes you want a very particular focus and concentration, and there is one professor at the university that you're at, and that's your option. But being aware of that, right? As you are kind of going through that, learn who your professors are, what some of those things are, because you're going to have that conversation someday about this is what our boundaries are, this is what my expectation is. I can say I was blessed because my advisor was on the more lax side, was just more outcomes focused. So he was like, as long as you get it done, John, I don't care. I don't care if you're in here 10 hours or 5 hours in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning. As long as we're getting that needle moved, that I think is the most important. But he was also very family focused, right? His family was in a different state. So on holidays, he was out of town. Over the summer, he was out of town. So he understood that balance on his end. So he obviously gave us the same balance on our end to be like, nope, you do what you have to do. Let's just keep you in communication. And as long as we're both on the same page, things are fine. But start early with those conversations, really kind of get a feel, talk to that professor's other students. They'll normally be able to give you a quick heads up on what to expect. There's usually a culture set, especially with more tenured professors. Everyone in that lab knows exactly what the professor expects. It's a little different with new professors, but that is something to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that's very helpful for us who are currently in graduate school and working directly with an advisor. And kind of zooming out back to the entire panel, and I want to start with you to show, what do you think about when you're setting boundaries? Is it preferable to use one way to do it or another? By that I mean, is it best to always have these conversations in person? What about over email? You mentioned that you told your boss early on in your career that, hey, I'm not coming on this Saturday afternoon. There was less than an hour of notice and we didn't talk about it during the week. So that was over the phone. But starting with you to show, what do you think? Is there a better way to do it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very situational, right? So it depends on what's going on. The smartest way to go about it would be in the way that the person you're delivering this news to best receives information. So if this person hates texting, you probably don't want to deliver your boundaries via a text message, or via email or something along those lines. So that was a very specific situation where, hey, you're calling me and asking me this, so I'm not driving down there to tell you I'm not coming. I'm telling you right now, I'm not coming. But I believe as many conversations as you can have in person, have them in person. That way this person can actually see your body language. Because when we tend to hear news that we don't like or we don't want to actually receive, we tend to hear it in a negative voice, right? Or hear it like, forget you, I'm not, and that may or may not be the case or the situation. So my advice would be understand who it is that you're speaking to and how they best receive information, and try your best to deliver it in that format. And when all else fails, try to do it in person as often as possible. Unless that person is recluse and then they don't want to talk, then don't actually try to force them to be in person.
I really echo that too, in terms of it's going to be pretty situational. It's going to depend on your relationship with that particular person. In many ways, if you're responding to a request, I think reciprocating whatever medium that request is. So like if they're calling you saying, "Can you come?" I mean, you probably wouldn't say, "Well, let me email you about it later," but if they're emailing you about it, you can respond. So in those ways, I think just kind of reciprocating through the medium. But if there's some other type of, something that needs to be communicated about why, or maybe it's, I like to do this, it's just now's not a good time for me to do it. Then maybe you need to have a little bit more, because managing the boundaries is, it's not just saying like, I will never do these things. It's just, I won't do them right now. I can do it tomorrow. I can do it next week. Being able to, it's kind of like, I don't know. I remember in my single days, if I were to ask a girl out and she just emphatically was saying no, I was less likely to ask them again. But if they said, "Oh, I'm not available that day, but is there a different time we could come?" Then I would know like, oh, well, they actually are interested, and you can kind of mimic that a little bit in the sense of how you're managing that boundary of saying, well, this just isn't a good time for it, but I'm interested in this task or this job, and so when is a better time that I could get this for you? So that's one idea.
Yeah, I think with that, I think I'm in the same camp. When I can do something in person, I'd rather, like, for the same reasons in terms of body language, and having those things. And, even like if you needed a tip of how to start that conversation the first time, you probably don't want to start off with, "These are my boundaries." But it's maybe starting off like, if it's a new professor, that new relationship, it's like, "Hey, what are your expectations of kind of this working relationship going forward?" That way they can tell you like, "I expect you 60 hours a week," and then you're like, "Oh, okay, now we need to negotiate some of this," or maybe you're fine with that and that works for that situation. But offering them kind of an entryway kind of helps with that first conversation. But I also would say, especially when it's some of those broader, those macro scale boundaries, probably send an email follow-up being like, "Hey, we talked about this. These are the things we agreed on," because that way when they come back and they ask you for that Saturday meeting in 1 hour, you can be like, "Hey, per our conversation, if you want to test the email, depending on the situation, right? If they're being really pushy about it, you can say like, 'Hey, we talked about this. This is what we agreed upon. Please see attached email.'" Having that in writing and in some type of agreement is often helpful to kind of protect yourself, especially when there is a power dynamic kind of between a professor and a student. You want to kind of be able to protect yourself a little bit like that.
I think that's great advice to kind of keep that record of the conversation, because we're all busy working professionals, and so it can be easy to forget, what we heard one of our colleagues say about their boundary, or if a project moves on, it's months later, we might have forgotten that boundary set because it wasn't in context, or it was no longer in like the front of our minds. And so I think that's great advice. Now, one thing we haven't talked about so far, I don't think in too much detail, is what happens when you try to set a boundary and someone responds very poorly, or they hear you, or at least you allegedly think they hear you, but they just continue to try to push, and then maybe you feel like you have to over explain or something. So have you encountered any situations like that where somebody has kind of kept pushing despite setting a boundary? And what would you recommend graduate students do, whether it's an advisor or a colleague or a fellow student, if they just kind of keep pushing despite having set that boundary?
I'm definitely giving this to one of you two.
I'm trying to think about this because it's like, if it's your advisor that's really prodding you and all of that, that's a really difficult one, I think, because there is that power dynamic, especially if that's like, you can't switch advisors within your college, or all of that. I think, man, that is such a difficult thing. And actually, going back to what John was saying, like think about that when you pick an advisor. So like my advisor, she actually wasn't necessarily an expert in my dissertation area. I largely picked her because of working style and working expectation. But I think that from that standpoint, you have to have clear communication with your advisor. If they're going to be, and actually, I think advisors that are quite candid about things and their expectations, they're okay with hearing that candidness as well. And so maybe don't necessarily shy with that. I think one of these instances where it is also a very tricky thing is summertime with an advisor, because some advisors, yeah, they'll kind of do other things in the summer. Some advisors, that is research time, and even though they're not on contract, this is research time. Like this is how you can get things done because you're not teaching classes. And some students might say, well, this is my summertime, and that's not what I'm going to do this summertime. But you really do have to have those conversations. It will do your advisor a service as well, because, and this is also a choice that you have to make, is if your advisor is expecting that from a student and you're not, wanting to do that, the advisor needs to know that. They need to know what that is, in case this relationship may not be the best relationship for a working relationship. And so I think and you'll be happier for it too, because now you've kind of set the boundary there for yourself. So I don't know. I think you just have to get the courage and to have that conversation, I guess.
I think the only thing that I can really add to that, if anything, is unfortunately there is also a higher structure within their organization, right? There is, maybe it's talking to your grad chair about it. They may or may not be able to directly impact the situation, but there are other channels often that can allow you to kind of get that assistance to have the conversations. That I've experienced. I've never had to go through it myself, but I've definitely heard others talk about it. But I think, Richard, you made a great point about summers. Summers are one of those very iffy areas, right? So engineering, fortunately, there's often a lot of funds to be thrown around. So professors are more likely to be like, hey, we'll pay you during the summer to come in and do work. Then you're working 40 hours a week, straight research, and it's fine. Like I had mentioned, my professor went out of town and was out. So any research, one, it did give me the freedom, but also I still had access to the lab. So I knew what I wanted to accomplish within my own career and my own expectations. So I went in and I did work over the summer because I knew that's what I needed to do to move my needle forward. But I also didn't have the pressure of feeling like I needed to be there every day. If I wanted to go I was in Hawaii, so if I wanted to go to the beach, I went to the beach. But it also meant that I just had to be responsible to myself and my own personal expectations of where I wanted to be 3-6 months down the line and what was ahead of me. And knowing and again, I think like we're talking about, know what's ahead of you. If I know I'm taking a large class load coming up and I still need to get a conference paper out, I use my summer to get most of that research done. So it's just some writing and brush up before that time those other deadlines came due.
One other thing I'll add to that, as John was talking, I was thinking about it, is because talking about like, yeah, there is some hierarchy to it. So if you feel like sometimes advisors can be abusive with time and they don't really know, they're just kind of like, oh, that's just the way they live the life. And if you feel like you're kind of getting time abused, certainly you can talk to department chairs or grad coordinators to try to get advice about how to deal with that particular advisor. The other thing is I might want to just take a second and reinterpret boundaries for a minute, because, especially when we think of these power dynamics of boundaries, is we've been mostly talking about time, but there also might be other boundaries that you don't want to be crossed. If your advisor is asking you to wash their car, no, like that is not a boundary. That is not a thing. That is not, they shouldn't be, say, come mow my lawn, this type of stuff. And even other work boundaries that might get fuzzy. We talk about like happy hour, we talk about social events and what the expectations may be and the communications may be for that. And so, especially if you're feeling like some of those kind of boundaries are starting to get really crossed, I think then it is kind of a conversation to have with grad advisor people or the department chairs if you feel like some personal boundaries are getting crossed, not just work and time boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that you brought up, setting the boundaries about more than just time, but also work responsibility. So if something, especially as a graduate student, if it's not within your GA contract or if it's something that seems unrelated at all to your studies or progression through your program, then that could be problematic. And I see that we are starting to run low on time. So one question that I know is on a lot of people's minds, especially through the COVID-19 pandemic over the last few years, is how do you shut off from work? So setting a boundary with ourselves. And so, Shell, you brought up turning off your phone, which is a great one. So I wanted to turn it back to you, if you don't mind, and ask you, are there any other ways in which you help yourself shut off from work when you've decided for the day that you're done working?
Yeah, I think Dr. Gardner and John both have brought up transitioning, right? And so the dad that put on a suit and went into his home office and then left and what, so if you can come up with some sort of a transition, right, that you're leaving school or you're leaving work and you're going into your happy time, that normally helps. And so for me, I normally will try to make a stop on the way home. So that's whether or not I go grab a cocktail, I go get groceries, but there's something that reminds me that that part of my day is over and I'm entering into a new part of my day. That tends to help getting yourself out of your normal routine, right? I love Dr. Gardner's point of I'll go to the library because this is a place where it's just too inconvenient for me to pick up my phone and walk out. So understanding what's going to help you transition, I think is probably the best. Even if it's setting a reminder on your phone that dings that it's happy hour or yoga time or whatever that is, create a transition for yourself.
I really like that. And did you, Dr. Gardner or Dr. Rano, have anything else that you do in your own lives when you've decided you're done for the day that you like to use to shut down?
You know, I don't know. I'm not very good at that. Again, in terms of like things get integrated a bit as a kind of a professor, and sometimes I always kind of talk with them about like it never really turns off. It just because it's thought work in many ways. Same with being like a business owner, all this type of stuff. It's even if I'm not at work physically or I'm not in front of a computer, there's still some like research question going on in my brain, or I see something that makes me think about something about work, and that's kind of a problem maybe for me is not being very segmented. But in some ways, I think it depends on what we are trying to segment. So my last little point, I guess, on two last points, and then I'll be done. And but is one is think you have to think about this stuff when you're thinking about your job. Ask these questions to the potential employer that you might have about time. Like I know if somebody did an interview and they asked them, "Do you have your work email on your cell phone?" Because they wanted to know whether they'd be accessible on their after hours or they have to go to a computer. You make the value judgment on that. You might really want to work at a place where you're going to work, very intensely and all throughout the night or whatever. That's totally fine. Just find what works for you. But I'd also say spend time on the things that kind of bring you joy. It's kind of this Marie Kondo idea of if it doesn't bring you joy, kind of get it out of your life. And when we think about that, the segmenting, integrating, the research stuff for me, that part of my job, I really quite enjoy. And so if that interrupts my home or my brain, I kind of let it in there and I say, oh, welcome to my home life here. But if it's an administrative thing, if it's like a request that's coming from, or like grading, I don't really particularly like to do. That is stuff that I just need to say, yeah, I'm going to spend this time doing that. Done. I'm through with it. It's not allowed in my brain elsewhere. So, uh, yeah, that's that's my last point on that.
Cecilia, I believe you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Okay. It's a quick question about this transition between pandemics and now that I don't even know if pandemic still, I think so. But anyway, there was a breakup in presential work, right? And normally we go to the department and we know when the professor or the graduate assistant, they had like the office time, right? Drop in time, that's called drop in time. And then during this pandemic's time, they kind of still have, but not very much. And we are being remotely working as well most of the time. So I wonder if do I have to call, let's say, to find out when is the drop-in time of a professor to have a chat about a certain detail on my research or something. And that is not, let's say, my advisor is somebody else that I want an opinion. And that, should I call the department, the secretary of the department to ask? I don't think they do have a list of this office time uh, or availability of. So anybody can say anything about that? Would you?
Well, maybe I'll pipe in. I'm on the other end of that kind of, office hour thing. I would say for sure, just email your professor, even if they don't have an in-person office hour. Because like when I had online class, I didn't do in-person office hour.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't even do online office hour because I actually found people didn't come to my office hours. But it doesn't mean they didn't want to talk to me. So I would make sure that students know that they can email me to set up a time to talk, and again, kind of giving those expectations to them about when you might be available to do that. So I might say, Tuesday, Thursday afternoons are work. I have it kind of blocked off to be flexible to meet with students. Just send me
Yeah.
an email. So anyway, I would just send your professor an email and say, "Is there a time that we can talk?" And they might say, "Yeah, sure. Here's what I think." You also might just give them 3 different times, and then they might pick one that works best for them. That helps too.
Okay. Yeah, I normally I email them even during office time, but that was something before that used to be common, like you had a quick question, you don't want to set up an appointment, can be too complicated, and you stop by, drop in, and say, hey, hi, what do you think about this? Would you take a quick look? Oh, yes, oh, no, I cannot do that right now. But that was a kind of an informal thing, and now we kind of don't have very often anymore. But yeah, email is the best best way to communicate.
Thank you so much for bringing up that point, Dr. Gardner, and clarifying. For Cecilia, John, I wanted to give you the chance to close us out here. I know you haven't yet gotten to answer how you shut down. So, do you have any final things you'd like to say before we close today's session?
Yeah. Dr. Carter, thank you for making me feel normal, that my brain doesn't shut off either. So I'm with you. And maybe it comes from that research side that is just, there's always a puzzle or a question in the back of your head. And I think it's okay if that is the case. But in terms of I guess another thing in terms of shutting off is something that I had to pick up recently was creating separate profiles on my electronics, because when my work things sat on the same side as my personal things, I would get those notifications, or you get even just the temptation of like opening that other email address, and then now you're like, oh, I should get to that email. So I think, right, especially when you're in grad school, it's normally your personal computer for everything. So I'll have one half of my computer with school stuff, and then one half of my computer for my personal life, when I still need to kind of get through your everyday emails, your bills and such. I think across ourselves, I think we need to kind of have those boundaries, because I'm lucky in terms of a job. I have a work phone and I have a personal phone, so I can just turn the work phone off and leave it on the charger. But I think, like most, I live on my phone. So if they were both in the same place, when I'm scrolling, I will have the tendency to scroll and go to another app that I probably shouldn't be. So having multiple profiles, I think, is a great way, or apps that shut off automatically and say, nope, you can't open me till 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, are all very helpful, kind of allowing yourself, because our digital life is so important to us now and so integrated, to make sure you have those boundaries in that digital sphere as well.
Yeah, I love that idea of creating that separation physically, or creating it on your devices so that you don't feel that temptation in either direction, to use time for work or family for the other purpose. And so I'd love to hear so much more from all three of you, but I know we have already gone 5 minutes over, and I don't want to steal any more of your time. I know what that's like in meetings, to see it tick by after the time. So I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Gardner, Dr. Hirano, Tashel, for giving us your time and expertise. And thank you all in here for coming and attending this panel. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again.